I almost said no, but honestly, water sounded great, and I was tired as hell. The camp was different again. Now, there were little stakes in the ground all over the place, marking out places to put support pieces, and a growing stack of logs for lumber. Some of the wood had been set over by the Rothani's shelter, and as I came up by the fire, Keith passed me a bowl of stew he'd worked on. It was pretty good, could use salt, but that was sort of a recurring issue here.
Hey, Keith, is there a way to get salt?
He considered a moment.
Well, I mean, it's possible, strictly speaking. Easiest way for us is to get access to seawater. Then, what you do is, you put seawater in a stock pot and boil her down till what you got left looks like wet sand. From there, you take it off the heat and let it dry. Bam, sea salt.
Seems simple enough.
How much would we need?
He scratched his chin for a moment, and I noticed for the first time that there was only scruff on his chin and above his mouth. Was he shaving with his survival knife? He finished his thought.
Well, on Earth, 5 gallons will get you about 4 cups of salt, but then our oceans are less salinized than they used to be, so yield might be higher here. It's a good catch. Salt and stuff is a good way to preserve stuff. Also, stuff tastes better. Got other stuff we gotta do first, though.
I nodded.
The shelter.
He shook his head.
There's that. But that's gonna be me and Ragnar. We got another thing, and you should take Greltha with you for it. Need you to start taking things to the other species here. Start showing them we don't need to be fighting each other. I'd do it, but I'm getting winded going to the bathroom right now. I gotta have me a talk with Annabelle.
That shook me. Of course, I knew that his plan was to bring on the others, but I'd assumed that was on hold until he was better.
But, I don't know what I'm doing with that.
I'd love to do that, hun. But truth of the matter is it can't wait. My shoulder'll take months to heal, and there's the ribs. Yeah, sure. Today we didn't have any eliminations, but that ain't gonna stay that way. Whenever the weather starts turning on us, we're gonna lose folks, and we need to get to 'em before that,
he said in his usual matter-of-fact way. From there, he got up and walked up to the bluff's edge, slowly trudging up to his spot, and I went along. The boon bags from earlier had been gathered here and laid out. Each one had its own alphabet on it, none of it in English. He pressed the green button on his wristband as he sat down, and Annabelle came up on screen.
Evening, Miss Annabelle. I'm needing a minute of your time if it's not too much trouble.
Annabelle was quick to respond.
I'd be happy to help, Keith, but before that, I was trying to do an interview with you earlier. Unfortunately, you were asleep most of the day, which I understand, given yesterday's events. Do you have time now?
Sure thing, darling. But first, my business. I need to know who sent us each of the boon bags. When we're done with that, then I'll answer any questions you care to ask me. Just be sure you want the answers.
He smiled as he said, but with a definite glint in his eyes. Keith was down an arm, panting from the effort of coming up the hill, and somehow he still looked like he was ready to fight. Annabelle and Keith went through the bags, 19 in all. As she went over the names of the various species, Keith had me write them down, using a small piece of charcoal, and the remains of the pizza box, the Vendrix, Gol, Vrasti, Trills. Keith laughed a quick second at that one. Skrens, Bausuts, Dongain, Hilgos, Anzoth, Trondrox, Agex, Olzul, Enod, Dohar, Gemnins, Aeslir, Krutals, Asu, and Virgils. With each name, she brought up a still image of the species, clearly from promotional materials from the games. Once we had names and some faces to put to them, Keith asked about getting some views of the species talking. I didn't understand why he did it until I started to understand the words a bit. Keith had figured out the trick for our nanites. They wouldn't necessarily know the difference between an alien's true voice and what they were hearing from the screen. He had Annabelle replaying bits until we both had full sentences coming from each. He was cheating the game, making it possible for us to understand their words, and had made sure I was there for it.
All right now, one last thing. I assuming that you've watched what's going on? More than just our end of things. Can you tell me who of those are in the worst shape right now?
Annabelle smiled. She was on to the game now.
Well, obviously you two are in the lead, and until yesterday, the Rothani were dead last, expected to be the next ones out. They're placed second now that they're working with you. After that, the Aeslir are doing the best.
Annabelle laid out the rankings. It went us, the Rothani, the Aeslir, Skrens, Hilgos, all the way down to the Asu and Virgul, who were struggling. And again, as she talked about the species, the footage came up, promotional material of the species, and I could see the wheels turning in Keith's head. He was noting landmarks. He'd just gotten Annabelle to, without asking, get at least basic languages for our nanites, faces to put to the species, and with landmarks, whereabout these species were. Direct questions like that would have likely been a negative, but he'd talked around it. There was a certain aspect to how his mind worked that could be terrifying at times. When it was finished and I had everything marked down, Keith sat back.
Now, Miss Annabelle, you've done held to your word, so I reckon I owe you some interview time. Val, I know you've had yourself a hell of a long day, so just have Ragnar bring up the vines, and I'll get myself to what work I can do, while I do my confessional thing.
The look he passed me told the story. He needed me out of the shot, now that he'd pulled off his trick. If there was blowback, he didn't want it hitting me. I took my pizza box of names and left him to his interview. I let Ragnar know to bring him the vines and check the shower. The bladder was already full, and I went inside the small confines to have a well-earned cleaning and engaged privacy mode. A hot shower helped not only physically but mentally as well. I was in so much better a mood as I came out of the shower and turned off privacy mode. I stepped into the tent to change clothing and saw something on my bed. A small bouquet of flowers, tied together with stems the same way we would make flower crowns on Earth. For Keith to have made this would have been a ton of work for him, and it was incredibly sweet. I know it's stupid and girly, but I just sat there for a bit, grinning like an idiot and sniffing the bouquet. Guys didn't really get me flowers. Yeah, the occasional thing from my dad, but I mean that doesn't really count, and it was only for big stuff like graduating high school. Aside from that, though, it just wasn't a thing, largely due to my athleticism, as most guys assumed that. Because of my liking sports, that meant flowers were out. Getting dressed, I went out, and it seemed that Ragnar and Keith were in the middle of a project here at the end of the day. Keith was whittling a small piece of wood, while Ragnar was smoking.
Keith, are you making a pipe?
Keith turned from where he sat at the fire, smiling.
Yep. So, as it turns out, the Rothani, much like some of our own Native American tribes, have a custom with smokin', so I figure, why not embrace it? Pop used to make these kinds of things, along with duck decoys. Pull up a seat.
But there isn't any tobacco.
I said, looking around. He did a sort of head bob.
Nah, you don't necessarily need tobacco. That's just what us humans came to for our regular smoking needs. There were some weeds in the guide that work for it. But it's good you're here. Greltha just got back, and I want to try a trick.
Keith called out over the waterfall side of the bluff for Greltha, who came up carrying a fish and a water container. When she arrived, Keith moved to a catch on his wristband and took it off.
All right, time for an experiment. Ragnar, put this on, and if the green light beeps and lights up, press it.
Here, something went off. Both Ragnar and Greltha, for the first time, looked angry, and it was sudden. Keith pulled back the wristband.
I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to cause offense.
Greltha caught her breath a second, then replied,
We know that, Keith. But for the Rothani, to bind one's wrists in shackles is the gravest offense. On Rothan, our homeworld, there were once invaders who enslaved our race for a long time, and it has stuck with us.
Keith nodded slowly.
I'm really sorry about that, but that's not what this is. Y'all destroyed your wristbands on the first day. The wristbands let you get your survival gear, boons from your people, and talk with your species council. They can be taken off whenever, but that's why you guys never got supplies to start with. I wanted to see if using the wristband could at least get y'all your things. It'd give us a ton of ability to move forward on stuff if we're not having to split gear. I promise, you can take it off immediately afterward, but just for the moment, please wear it.
Ragnar and Greltha looked to each other, and it was Greltha who stepped forward, taking the offered wristband and put it on. Sure enough, as soon as it resized, the green button lit up and the beep sounded. Greltha pressed the button, and a container appeared, this time with what I had to assume was Greltha's name on it, and a screen popped up with one of her own people there, much as Annabelle had been for us. They went over things, the same as they did with us. It was kind of perversely hilarious watching it, and Greltha opened her container, seeing the contents again, much the same as our own. Next, she removed the wristband and passed it to Ragnar, who repeated the process, then returned the wristband to Keith. We'd just doubled our effective tools for survival, and Keith had an incredibly self-satisfied grin on his face. His words from the other day came back. You have to know when to break the rules. Somewhere along, Keith had stopped playing the game and was now actively playing against it. The strange thing was, we hadn't heard from Ravajatik since then, had received no censure by whatever counted as referees, and we were still receiving items as normal, and the communication with Annabelle was still working. Keith was flipping them all off repeatedly with malice aforethought now, and they still had yet to come back at him about it. Did they just not realize? Or did they not get why he'd do it? There were a lot of questions with no attainable answers in the foreseeable future. Keith and Ragnar finished up their whittling of pipes, then sat smoking some sort of local weed together with Greltha. I certainly wasn't taking up smoking right now, but they all looked really happy, just relaxing, having a smoke by a warm fire. Even though they were essentially playing, you only had to look around the camp to see that progress had been made. Greltha's trees that she'd pushed down had been stripped of branches and stacked, though not broken down into logs yet. Looking at the trees, Greltha at least was far stronger than any human I've ever seen. After their smoke break, we did some basic prep work, taking vines, pulling them apart, and then weaving them back together as 3-strand rope. While we certainly had paracord and rope, Keith wanted to be as economical with it as possible, and thus, making new ropes for use was a priority. I think it also gave him something he could do, even as injured as he was. Though I was aware he had to take somewhat frequent breaks, generally either the shoulder or his ribs making even small tasks take noticeably longer. Again, I wasn't about to complain, and with the Rothani helping, he wasn't directly needed for his physical skills. He would be weeks on the mend, but he seemed to be trying to do what he could, which was an encouraging sign. Eventually, with as much done as we figured we could get to, it was time to get to bed. I helped Keith into his hammock, but apparently, he had a little bit more to talk about.
Val, in the morning, you and Grelth are heading out. We need to be making contact with the other species. Get any that'll come back. I'd do it, but I'm getting winded when I go down to take a leak, let alone any larger trek.
Keith, this is your plan. I don't know what I'd be doing.
I replied, sitting on my own hammock. He paused for breath.
Sure you do. They ain't that much different than us. Come right down to it. They're all just trying to survive this thing and keep their people out of chains. You were an office manager before, right? I need you to headhunt the other species and convince them we're their best bet. This is something you're already skilled at. We need to find the Virgil and the Asu first, since it seems they're not faring too well.
I hadn't really thought about it like that. For all that all these various species were very visibly different than us, they were trying to do the same thing as we were. The same basics of life were true throughout the competition. Safe drinking water, a safe, warm place to sleep, and food. It didn't really require much else to get started. I pulled out the pizza box.
All right. The Virgil are the lizard people, right?
Keith considered.
Yeah, but I'd reckon they're more like stegosaurs with the backplates. The Asu are the upright bunny folk. They might be a bit harder, 'cause they're fast, and I'm pretty sure they're herbivores.
Wait, but if they're herbivores, wouldn't that make them less of a threat?
I paused.
Hell no. A bear'll run away from yelling hey bear at it and banging some pots. A moose or elk, if they think they can take you, they'll fuck your world up. Predator animals are fundamentally lazy. They don't want to fight you to kill you. It's all about conserving energy for them.
He chuckled a bit and winced shortly after. We went over some more details before I laid down and went to sleep. I was woken just before dawn by Greltha, who was wearing her own pack and gear.
Miss Val, it is time to depart. We have a long journey ahead of us.
I got up, stretching, and like Greltha, packed up items. I sifted through the boon bags, finding the symbols that had displayed with the Asu and the Virgil, and we headed out. Checking the bags, there was a hand-woven length of red cloth, with gold filigree, bearing 3 gold claw marks in the middle for the Virgil. For the Asu, it was a sort of beaded choker. I put the choker on and hung the cloth over my backpack, hoping that they would see them and give us a moment to talk and get to understand our language.
Hey everyone, hope you loved the video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for more awesome sci-fi content. You can also support us by hitting the thanks button or becoming a channel member. Your generosity helps us bring you more stellar stories. Every bit counts. Thanks a bunch.